Welcome to session 2 of our study of Ruth, gleaning God in every day. It's a great little story. We're going to say something over and over again throughout this story. It's a phrase that I think sums up the greatness of this story. Ruth is the redemption story of the whole Bible in 4 chapters and 3 characters. Someone told me the other day, we were studying Ruth, and they said, in my Bible, Ruth is only 4 pages long. It's a short little story, but it's a story packed with lots of meaning and lots of significance as we dive into this story over the next several sessions. Last session, we dealt with Ruth chapter 1 at the very beginning, just the first 5 verses almost as an introduction to the story. And now we're going to continue to look at chapter 1 in this session. As we do that, this is the story that happens, and this rest of this chapter is really just the conversation between 3 women, the 3 women who are left behind after the deaths of their husbands in the first 5 verses. There is Naomi, the mother-in-law, there is Orpah, and there is Ruth, her daughters-in-law, and they are in this chapter, and there's a conversation that happens there. It's pure dialogue in this section of Ruth. There's very little action in the first chapter, but it's also kind of a gripping scene. So let me read to you from Ruth chapter 1, 6 through 18. They lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her God. Turn back after your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so, even if death separates me from you." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. So the story of these 3 women is that, on one hand, they're dealing with a very specific issues to them. They have all lost their husbands. Naomi has lost her husband and her 2 sons, and these 2 women, Orpah and Ruth, have lost their husbands, Naomi's sons. And so they're also dealing with a very specific situation, particular circumstances. But it's also something of a story that deals with all of the things that are wrapped up in all of the human story of suffering. At the same time, they're really grappling with the larger story of human struggle that's common to all people in all places and at all times. They are processing all of this suffering aloud in this conversation, and they each have a very specific response to it. And each of their 3 responses is a response that we can learn from as we dive into them and understand what they might mean. So I divided Ruth chapter 1 up into a few scenes, and to help us discover what the story teaches us all about. The first scene is a look at Naomi's despair as we get into the theology of suffering. That's really the theme, the overarching theme of this remainder of chapter 1, the theology of suffering. And the first scene is about Naomi's despair. When Naomi decided that she had had enough, that she had been there in Moab with her husband Elimelech, and they had moved there because there was a famine back in Israel, and now they were returning because they had heard, Naomi had heard that the Lord had restored Israel and the famine had been lifted. There was food down there, and so she thought she'd go back home amongst her own people. And so she decides to go there to a place where she had been before, and to one place she was returned. And on the road there, she turns to her daughters-in-law and says, go back amongst your own people, because you have a better chance of finding a husband in that situation than you do as a foreign woman, a Moabite woman amongst the people of Bethlehem of Israel. So she decides to go back home, and she decides this because it was the custom, you might read law, that in Israel that the Israelites were to provide for the widows and the orphans. So she turns back and she kissed them and she goes on her way. She kind of looks to kind of leave them behind and kind of leave that part of her life behind. She's separating herself from the point of her suffering. But they both initially insisted, no, instead we will return with you to your people. Ruth, Orpah, both, they say there's no way we're leaving you. And so Naomi launches into a longer kind of a case for why going their separate ways is necessary for them. There's a lot in her explanation, and it's highly particular to her time and her culture. So this is what happens in verse 11 and verse 13. Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there be any sons in my womb, that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters. Go. I am too old for a husband. If I were to say I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grow up? Would you refrain from having a husband? No, my daughters. It's far more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me." Again, we better be careful in any of these stories that we're reading in the story of Ruth, not to read it as a modern kind of person who has all the answers, kind of figuring out what's going on in our culture. Because to anyone who had heard it originally, they would have understood that there was a law or a custom that if a man died and left a widow that was childless without a male son specifically, then his younger brother was to marry that woman and have a child with her that would become his older brother's child, so that his name could continue to be carried on in that. And so Naomi is saying to Ruth and to Orpah, I'm not going to have any more sons, and even if I had a son now, you'd be way too old to marry them when they got to be old enough to be married. So that's just go on without you. Now, this might bring to mind for those of us New Testament Christians a trap that was laid for Jesus in Matthew 22, where some Sadducees who deny that there's a resurrection, it says, come to Jesus. They ask, "Teacher, Moses says if a man who doesn't have children dies, his brother must marry his wife and produce children for her, for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married, then died. Because he had no children, he left his widow to his brother. The same thing happened with the second brother and the third, and in fact all 7 brothers. Finally the woman died. At the resurrection, they said, which of the 7 brothers will be her husband? They were all married to her." Now, again, it's important to point out that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. That's one of the things that's pointed out at the very beginning of this story. But they were really trying to just trap Jesus to an understanding of that, because they knew that the custom of the day was that that's exactly what would happen, that even 7 brothers, they would marry that. Ruth is saying to her daughters-in-law, "I'm not going to have any more sons. There's no chance you could do this." It's also important that we kind of understand that reality as we get into the end of the story of Ruth later on. Ruth and Orpah are not likely to find husbands as immigrants in Israel. They will have better chances to stay in Moab, return to their families, return to the land where they came from, and find husbands amongst their own people. So this is a long goodbye, but it culminates in a telling line. Now this is the key moment, because up to this point, Naomi has been merely recounting the facts of her situation. I'm no use to you. I don't see how any of the 3 of us might build a family together. But you're young. Go back there. Go back to your home amongst your own people and rebuild your life. But then there's a phrase at the end of that section where Naomi makes a turn that we all can make at times in the midst of our suffering. She goes from recounting her life's events to interpreting the meaning of those events. She moves from facts to poetry, from history to philosophy, from suffering to God's role in her suffering. The Lord's will has come out against me, she says. It's sort of like when we modern day people ask questions like, why does a good God let bad things happen? Maybe you've asked that question before, and at times we all probably asked that question. Why does a good God let bad things happen? Why, when there's a death of a spouse, like in this story, when we're an inability to have children, when there's a divorce, disease, whatever it might be, when there's suffering, chaos that enters our world, why does a good God let bad things happen? G.K. Chesterton, a preacher and theologian from days gone by, said the worst moment for an atheist is when he is really thankful and has nobody to thank. But that's true, and it's equally true that the worst moment for the Christian is when she's suffering, and the God that she spent so many breaths thanking, she now finds herself blaming. That's Naomi's story that's happening here. Naomi's interpretation of her life's events is to define herself as cursed. Cursed equals being cut off from abundance. Cursed equals being cut off from abundance. Now, life to the full just doesn't seem to be in the cards that I've been dealt. So she thinks I'm just cursed. God is not involved in my life anymore. She has endured an unimaginable amount of grief, and the burden of that grief has now become too heavy for her to hold in one hand while clinging to hope in the other. So she defines herself as cursed. And so staying with her, she says, is a dead end for Orpah and for Ruth. The result of which is that she begins to seek to isolate herself in her grief, creating distance between her and the two people most capable of relating to her, of empathizing with her, of walking alongside her with pain. I mean, isn't that something we do from time to time when things are bad? I just don't be around me. Nobody wants to be around me. Woe is me. Things are bad. I need to be alone. That's kind of what she's doing. But she needs these women, these daughters-in-law of hers, to be able to be with her to live into this kind of situation. One of the truths of this story of Ruth that we need to kind of gather around ourselves is that the way we understand God as being involved in the suffering and the chaos of our life greatly shapes how we deal with those hardships, with that chaos. The way we understand how God is involved in all of it helps us better understand how we can deal with it. In other words, the story we tell ourselves about where God is in our suffering helps us to understand what we think about our suffering. It's kind of a theological point of view. Remember the first name that we mentioned in the entire story of Ruth? Her husband, her dead husband now, Elimelech. Naomi's late husband's name means God is King. And we landed last week in our last session about the acknowledging that Elimelech is kind of the difference between acknowledging a confession of faith and then what actually happens in your life, where we're saying what we think, but then are we living this out? Are we doing this? And the God we worship and the chaos that happens in everyday life, how do we hold those things in tension together? That's why Naomi's story, her little story in 4 chapters, is a part of the larger story of human history. It's a promise for where both of these stories are going. The whole biblical story is a story of Elimelech's hope that God would once again be king. Remember in the beginning of the story we looked at in our first session about how in Genesis there were certain things that happened because God was king. And now in the second, at the end of the Bible, in Revelation, there are things that happen again when God once again becomes king. That means the more difficult the chaos happens in our lives and the nearer that becomes, the harder it is for us to hold on to that. It's like when we cry out something like, where are you, God, in the midst of whatever we're going through at the moment. In the midst of everything, Naomi starts to kind of cry out against God and distance herself from her daughters-in-law. And I guess in some ways we understand it. It kind of makes perfect sense. Because it's much easier to get away from negative feelings and emotions than it is to engage them. Even if engaging them is necessary for the fullest kind of healing. She redefines herself in light of her suffering and then tells the story that justifies her isolation. Now, Naomi's isolation only makes sense to her as long as she defines herself as cursed. And the other two people are merely unlucky but not bitter like she is. There are very sincere motives behind Naomi's reaction to these horrible circumstances that she's going through. They're as harsh as any of us could really ever imagine. But at the same time, we begin to see that she tells herself a story about herself herself and about her own grief that profoundly begins to influence her view of God, of other people, and even of herself. But the story doesn't end there. Her story doesn't end there. It's just getting going. The second part of this scene that we pay for in this part of the picture is this idea of when she starts to have a little bit of hope. What we find is that in this story, when Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth to kind of turn back and go away, we find that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and turned to go back home. She left, but Ruth stayed with Naomi. Now, I remember we talked about the importance of names in this story, and the name Orpah meant back of the neck. Now, that's interesting because what do we see is the last thing we see of Orpah in this story is the back of her neck as she turns to walk away from her mother-in-law, from Naomi. Ruth, remember, it's the redemption story of the whole Bible in 4 chapters and 3 characters. But in this story, Orpah is not one of those 3 characters. She's been a character up to now, but now she leaves the story and we never hear from her again. She walks away. So the story happens. Now, while we know that some things are happening in the ways that God rules in the beginning are different from the ways that God rules now, maybe, but the promise of God ruling in the end. So we have heard in the story of Naomi and Ruth and Orpah and all their stories that there's a struggle for food, a struggle for family, there's death involved. But the next verse, we start to hear a hint of how God is going to renew and address all of this in this little small 4-chapter story. A glimpse of how God will handle that. So while Orpah turns and walks away from Naomi, Ruth says something different. Don't urge me to abandon you, she says. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I think that's an important thing. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Notice that Ruth's commitment to stand by Naomi as her person is it's simultaneously a commitment to trust in the God of Israel that she barely knows, that she's only probably gotten to know, really, as she became married to one of Naomi's sons. It might remind us of a story of a time when Jesus was once asked by an expert of the law, what's the greatest commandment? And his response is likely familiar to you. Jesus said the greatest commandment is this: you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's the response that Jesus gives. Jesus, in that moment, is joining together a love for God and a love for people, claiming that they are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. In fact, if one of these is missing, it is evidence that the other one it might be missing as well. The Apostle John would later say, if your spirituality, if your faith does not demonstrate itself by love for others, it indicates that you haven't really fully experienced God's love. True discipleship was always rooted in serving others. Dear friends, John says, let us love each other because love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and comes from God. One of the core pieces of the evidence that I am a disciple of Jesus is that I am a person who loves others. So in Ruth's response, we see the most redemptive version of a no. Naomi declares, Ruth declares, I'm not going anywhere. And then she goes on to make an oath of loyalty not only to Naomi, but to God. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Her commitment to stand by Naomi is also a commitment to stand in trust of God, who has now she come to know through Naomi. A different interpretation of God's role in her story of suffering leads to a different response to nearly identical circumstances. Ruth doesn't see herself as cursed by the God who abandoned her. Instead, she holds on to the God she barely knows in the midst of her suffering. I mean, I certainly imagine that getting away from her mother-in-law would have been tempting on some level. After all, Naomi is probably the constant reminder of Ruth's pain. She's the one who can remind her of pain by her very presence. She probably sees the face of her dead husband every time she looks at her mother-in-law's face. She hears his voice every time she hears her mother-in-law's voice. She's the one who can keep her most present in her pain. But Naomi is the very person that Ruth moves towards in the midst of her suffering. She doesn't keep in touch with Naomi. She doesn't just kind of check in every once in a while to see how her mother-in-law of old is doing. She clings to her. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. She becomes a living example of the faithful love of God, even in the darkest circumstances and the greatest suffering. So this story is a story of kind of three different responses to a very similar suffering. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and Ruth clung to her. Orpah goes back home. This is the last time we see her in the story. And a subtle theme that I don't really want us to miss when we read a story like Ruth is that not everyone kind of gets woven into the story of God's redemption. We have a decision to make at some level about whether or not we're going to let this story be our story, or if we're going to turn and show the back of our neck and kind of walk away back to other ways, our older ways, or the ways in which God is not unfolding this great story of redemption. Orpah has the same invitation from God to cling to her mother-in-law, to walk into this incredible story. She doesn't do anything wrong. She doesn't fly off the handle. She doesn't blame God. She doesn't accuse or demonize anybody. She simply goes back home. And therefore, she misses out on the majesty of God's redemption. So there's a great story here that sets the place for three different responses to suffering. Turn and walk away from the story, as Orpah does. Blame God in the midst of her suffering. Or cling to hope in the midst of that suffering. Our response is a story that we can learn from, and which character we're going to be in our own story of God's great redemption.